Power is a strange and intoxicating substance. Most people, if given absolute control over a nation, would try to improve the lives of their neighbors, build schools, or ensure that no one goes hungry. But history shows us a different, much more unsettling side of the human psyche. Throughout the centuries, certain individuals have risen to the pinnacle of authority and used that position not to build, but to dismantle the very fabric of human dignity. They didn't just lead, they dominated, creating systems of such profound cruelty that they challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. When we talk about these figures, we aren't just talking about bad politicians or failed generals. We are talking about the architects of systematic misery. Today, we are peeling back the layers of history to explain the most notorious leaders ever to walk the earth. We aren't just looking at what they did, but why they did it, how they gained the trust of millions, and the lasting scars they left on our collective memory. This is a deep dive into the psychology of absolute power and the warning signs that history has been trying to give us for thousands of years. To begin this journey, we have to travel back to ancient Rome, a place that perfected the art of the cult of personality. While Rome produced many great thinkers, it also produced Caligula. His real name was Gaius Caesar, but he earned the nickname Caligula, which means little boot, from the soldiers his father commanded. Early on, he was actually loved by the Roman people. He was young, charismatic, and brought a sense of hope after the grim years of his predecessor. But something shifted. After a severe illness, Caligula emerged as a completely different man. He began to demand that he be worshipped as a living god. He didn't just want political loyalty, he wanted spiritual submission. He would walk through the streets of Rome dressed as different deities, forcing senators to run alongside his chariot for miles. What makes Caligula a prototype for the figures we are discussing today is his absolute disregard for the value of other people. He saw the entire Roman Empire as his personal playground. He famously planned to make his favorite horse Incitatus, a consul of Rome, simply to show that he could humiliate the highest governing body in the land. His rule was characterized by a whim-based cruelty. He would have people removed from the census or stripped of their wealth just to satisfy a passing impulse. He wasn't following a grand ideology. He was simply indulging in the purest form of narcissism. By the time his own guards realized he was a threat to the very existence of the state, the damage was done. Caligula proved that when a leader believes they are above the laws of nature and man, the result is a descent into a nightmare of unpredictability. Moving forward in time, we encounter a figure whose name has become synonymous with terror, Vlad the Impaler. Known to history as Vlad III, the Prince of Wallachia, he is often the inspiration for fictional monsters, but the reality was far more grounded and far more calculated. Vlad lived in a world of constant conflict, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. His methods were designed to send a message. He believed that the only way to maintain order in a chaotic land was through absolute, unyielding fear. He didn't just defeat his opponents. He displayed them in ways that were intended to break the spirit of anyone who dared to challenge him. The most famous story involves a forest of poles where thousands of people were displayed as a warning to an invading army. When the opposing forces saw the scale of the cruelty, they reportedly turned around and left, unable to process the level of brutality they were witnessing. Vlad's logic was that a single act of extreme harshness would prevent the need for years of war. He saw himself as a stern judge, a man who could clean up his country by removing anyone he deemed dishonest or lazy. But in doing so, he lost his humanity. He became a prisoner of his own reputation. His story shows us that leaders who justify cruelty in the name of security or order often end up creating a world that is far more dangerous than the one they were trying to protect. As we transition into the modern era, the scale of systematic oppression reaches heights that would have been unimaginable to the tyrants of old. This is largely due to the birth of totalizing ideologies. One of the most significant examples is found in the reign of a leader who turned his own country into a massive experiment in human engineering. We are talking about the era of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The goal was to transform a traditional, agrarian society into an industrial superpower overnight. On paper, it sounded like a vision of progress. In reality, it was a catastrophe of hubris. This leader believed that willpower alone could overcome the laws of economics and biology. He encouraged farmers to stop growing food and start smelting poor-quality steel in their backyards. He ordered the elimination of sparrows, thinking it would save grain, only to cause an ecological imbalance that led to a massive plague of locusts. When the resulting famines began to take hold, The government refused to acknowledge the problem. They continued to export grain while millions of their own people went without. This wasn't necessarily born out of a desire to cause suffering, but out of an absolute refusal to admit error. The ideology was more important than the people it was supposed to serve. During the Cultural Revolution, children were encouraged to turn against their parents and students against their teachers. The social fabric of an entire civilization was shredded in an attempt to maintain a grip on purity and power. It serves as a haunting reminder that a leader who thinks they have the perfect plan for humanity is often the one who causes humanity the most harm. Then there is the figure who perfected the banality of the system, a leader who came to power in the heart of Eurasia during the mid-20th century. He didn't start as a flamboyant orator. He started as a bureaucrat, a man who understood the power of files, lists, and committees. He created a system where everyone was a potential informant and everyone was under suspicion. His purges were not random acts of anger. They were cold, calculated removals of anyone who could possibly offer an alternative vision for the country. He would have people erased from photographs and history books as if they had never existed. In this system, the state became a god, and he was its high priest. He engineered artificial shortages to break the will of specific regions, using hunger as a political tool. The sheer number of people who disappeared into the vast network of labor camps is a testament to a leader who viewed human beings as nothing more than statistics. He believed that gratitude is a sickness suffered by dogs, and he lived his life by that motto. Even his closest allies were never safe. This leader's legacy is the hollowed-out soul of a nation, where trust was replaced by a constant, low-level dread. He proved that you don't need to be a manic god king to be a monster. You just need to be a very efficient manager of misery. Further south, in Southeast Asia during the 1970s, another leader took the idea of starting over to its most extreme and terrifying conclusion. He wanted to create a year zero, a total reset of civilization. He believed that the city was a source of corruption and that only the peasant life was pure. When his forces took control of the capital, they ordered the entire population to leave within hours. Hospitals were emptied, schools were closed, and millions of people were forced into the countryside to work as manual laborers. This leader didn't just want to control the present, he wanted to destroy the past. Books were burned, money was abolished, and wearing glasses was seen as a sign of being an intellectual, which was treated as a crime. Families were broken apart, and children were raised by the state to be soldiers and executioners. The sheer speed and totality of this transformation led to the disappearance of nearly a quarter of the country's population in just a few years. It was a vision of a utopia that was actually a massive prison. It shows us that a leader who talks about returning to a simpler time often means a time where they have absolute control over your every thought and action. We also have to discuss the leaders who used the concept of nationalism as a weapon. In the Balkans and parts of Africa, we have seen figures who rose to power by convincing one group of people that their neighbors were the cause of all their problems. This is the us versus them mentality taken to its logical, horrific end. They used the media to dehumanize others, calling them insects or weeds that needed to be cleared away. These leaders didn't pull the triggers themselves, but they created the psychological environment where ordinary people felt justified in committing unspeakable acts. In one African nation in the 1990s, 100 days of total social collapse was orchestrated by a small group of leaders who distributed tools of harm and used radio broadcasts to direct the violence. It is a chilling example of how fragile the veneer of civilization is and how easily a charismatic but hateful leader can peel it away. These leaders understand that fear is the most powerful motivator, and if you can make a population afraid of their neighbors, you can get them to do anything. But why do people follow these leaders? This is the question that haunts historians. It is rarely because the population is evil. Often, it's because these leaders arrive at a time of great crisis. They speak to the frustrations of a people who feel they have been ignored or humiliated. They promise easy answers to complex problems. They provide a sense of belonging and a clear enemy to blame. By the time the true nature of the leader is revealed, the system of control is already too strong to break. Psychologists often point to the dark triad of personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Many of these historical figures display all three. They have an inflated sense of self-importance, a willingness to manipulate others for their own gain, and a total lack of empathy for the suffering of others. When these traits are combined with a position of absolute power, the result is a catastrophe. They aren't held back by the same moral or emotional barriers that the rest of us take for granted. To them, a human life is just a resource to be used or an obstacle to be moved. In the mid-20th century, the world witnessed the most industrialized form of this cruelty. A leader in Western Europe built an entire state around a hierarchy of human value. His ideology was obsessed with purity and strength, but it was built on a foundation of resentment. He transformed a modern, educated nation into a machine of expansion and exclusion. The level of organization he brought to his prejudices was something the world had never seen. He utilized the latest technology, from radio to rail, to ensure that his vision of a cleansed continent could be realized. He turned the machinery of progress against humanity itself. The legacy of this leader is a warning that remains at the center of our global consciousness. He proved that even the most advanced societies can fall under the spell of a leader who offers a vision of glory built on the suffering of others. His rise was legal, his speeches were popular, and his supporters were legion. He shows us that the ultimate danger isn't a monster who looks like a monster, but a leader who looks like a savior to a desperate people. We also see this pattern in leaders who take over through military might and then transform into cult leaders. In Central Africa during the 1970s, one leader declared himself there King of Scotland and the conqueror of the British Empire. His rule was a bizarre mix of buffoonery and extreme violence. He would host lavish banquets while his people starved and had his rivals disappear in broad day. He exploited the divisions left behind by colonial rule to solidify his power, showing that those who are victims of oppression can sometimes grow up to be the most vicious oppressors themselves. He was eventually removed, but the economic and social damage he did took generations to heal. So, how do we explain these figures in detail? They are the result of a perfect storm of factors. They require a society in distress, a weak or crumbling system of checks and balances, and a personality that is uniquely suited for manipulation and cold-blooded decision-making. They often start by fixing a genuine problem. Perhaps they stabilize the currency or fix the roads, which buys them the initial loyalty of the people. Once they have that loyalty, they begin to dismantle the institutions that could oppose them. They hollow out the courts, they silence the press, and they replace experts with loyalists. What is most disturbing is the aura of inevitability they create. They make it feel like their rule is the only possible path forward. They use myths and symbols to tie themselves to the very identity of the nation. To speak against the leader is seen as speaking against the country itself. This merge of the leader and the people is a classic hallmark of these regimes. It makes dissent feel like treason. However, history also shows us that these leaders are almost always the architects of their own downfall. Their hubris eventually leads them to take risks they can't handle. They start wars they can't win, or they push their own people until they have nothing left to lose. Because they have surrounded themselves with yes men, they lose touch with reality. They stop receiving honest information and start making decisions based on their own delusions. In the end, their empires crumble, often leaving behind a legacy of ruin and a population that has to grapple with the question of how they allowed it to happen. We see this cycle repeated across cultures and continents, from the ancient emperors of the East to the modern dictators of the West. The story of the evil leader is a story of human nature gone wrong. It is a story of what happens when we let our fears and our prejudices be guided by a single, unchecked voice. It is a reminder that the price of freedom is constant vigilance, and that we must always be wary of those who offer simple solutions to our most profound problems. In explaining these leaders, we must also look at the enablers. These are the people who didn't necessarily share the leader's psychology, but who followed orders because it was easier or more profitable than resisting. The bureaucrat who signs the lists, the soldier who guards the camps, the neighbor who stays silent when their friend is taken away. These systems of profound harm can only exist if thousands of ordinary people agree to help. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. It's the idea that the greatest horrors in history aren't committed by monsters, but by people who have simply decided not to think for themselves. This is why studying history is so vital. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about recognizing the patterns. It's about seeing the red flags before the ship hits the iceberg. When we see a leader who attacks the truth, who encourages hostility between different groups, and who demands absolute personal loyalty over the rule of law, we are seeing the ghost of those we have discussed today. The faces change, the technology changes, but the underlying mechanisms of power and manipulation remain the same. The stories of these leaders are dark, But they also highlight the incredible resilience of the human spirit. For every Caligula or Vlad, there were thousands of people who resisted, who helped their neighbors, and who eventually rebuilt their societies. The scars are there, but the healing is possible. We explain these leaders in detail, not to glorify them, but to demystify them. We want to show that they weren't supernatural forces. They were people. And because they were people, we can understand how they acted and ensure that we don't provide the same fertile ground for their successors. The leaders we've discussed represent a dead end for humanity. They offer a vision of the world that is closed, fearful, and divided. But the alternative is always available. We can choose leaders who value empathy, who respect the truth, and who understand that real strength comes from cooperation, not domination. We can build systems that protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. History is a record of our failures, but it is also a roadmap for our future. As we look at the maps of the old empires and the ruins of the grand palaces, we should remember that the power of these individuals was ultimately an illusion. It was a power borrowed from the consent and the silence of the millions. When that consent was withdrawn, the gods were revealed to be just men, often frightened and small. They left behind a trail of sorrow, but they also left behind a lesson that we can never afford to forget. In the 20th century alone, the world underwent a series of lessons in the form of these leaders. We saw how a radio can be used to spread harmony or hate. We saw how a railway can be used to connect cities or to move people to places of no return. We saw how the concept of science can be twisted to justify the most unscientific prejudices. We have learned that progress is not a straight line. It is a struggle. And part of that struggle is being honest about the darker chapters of our story. One of the most profound things we learn when we explain these leaders in detail is that they almost all shared a profound sense of victimhood. They convinced themselves and their followers that they were the ones being persecuted, that they were the underdogs fighting against a global conspiracy or a hidden enemy. This sense of being a victim gave them the moral license to do anything. It turned their aggression into self-defense. This is a powerful and dangerous psychological trick that is still being played today. If you can convince a group of people that their existence is at risk, they will tolerate any level of cruelty in the name of survival. We must also acknowledge that many of these leaders were product of their times. They were shaped by the wars, the economic crashes, and the social upheavals that preceded them. They were the monsters that were born in the dark of those crises. This tells us that the best way to prevent the rise of such individuals is to create a world that is stable, fair, and hopeful. If people feel that they have a future, they are much less likely to listen to a demagogue who promises to burn everything down. When we look at the lists of these figures, from the Caribbean to the steppes of Asia, we see a global phenomenon. There is no one culture or race that is immune to this. It is a human problem. It is a flaw in our operating system that allows us to be moved by charisma and fear. But we also have patches for that flaw. We have education, we have the free exchange of ideas, and we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are the tools we use to keep the monsters at bay. In conclusion, the most notorious leaders in history weren't anomalies. They were the logical result of power left unchecked and a population motivated by fear. They were individuals who looked into the abyss and decided to jump in, taking millions of people with them. By explaining them in detail, we strip away the glamour of their legend and show the hollow, desperate reality of their rule. They are a mirror that shows us what we are capable of when we lose our way. But by looking into that mirror, we can also see the path back to our best selves. We can choose a different kind of leadership, a different kind of society, and a different kind of future. The darkness of the past is a deep and difficult subject, but it is one that we must face with open eyes. We owe it to those who suffered to remember their stories and to learn the lessons they paid so dearly for. We owe it to the future to be the ones who said never again and actually meant it. The study of these leaders is not just a study of the past. It is an active participation in the protection of our world today. Keep your eyes on the truth. Stay curious about the complexities of human nature, and never underestimate the power of a single person to stand up and say no to a system of harm. That is how the story truly changes. History is a conversation between the past and the present. By talking about these figures, we are deciding which parts of their legacy we will accept and which we will reject. We are defining the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is an outrage to our common humanity. The Titans may have fallen, and the empires may have withered into dust, but the questions they raised remain. How do we live together? How do we use our power? And what kind of ancestors do we want to be? Those are the questions that will define the next 1,000 years of our history. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the most difficult but necessary parts of our story. Stay vigilant, stay empathetic, and always remember that the light of truth is the best defense against the return of the dark.